James always manages to make this sound dirty.
No,
I was saying to him last night that it was so wholesome in my mind before he read it to me.
No, I've got a proper dirty bit coming up later. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest Booker Prize podcast with me, James Walton.
And me, Jo Hamier.
And today we're tackling a book that was voted the third favourite of the entire nation in the BBC Big Read project of 2003, behind only Lord of the Rings and Pride and Prejudice. In 2004, the author was named in a BBC poll the 11th most influential person in British culture. In 2019, he was knighted for services to literature. And for our purposes, it's also the only children's book in the history of the world that's ever been longlisted for the Booker Prize. And it is The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman. And this is our second week of podcasting, and I must say we're absolutely delighted with the response so far. Lots of lovely comments, lots of lovely subscribers, and so far so good. Except for one thing, Jo.
Yeah, no, I'm going to cut across all your really genuine thanks, which I do echo, but I'm going to be petty because I deserve it. So, listeners of last week's episode 2 will know that I put up a really robust defence of the main character's sanity.
Robustish.
Well, translator of The Vegetarian by Han Kang, Deborah Smith, agrees with me.
Oh, God.
She's written in to say, such a rigorous and informed defence of Young Hai's sanity. And she's also said, to both our credit, engaging, thoughtful and generous conversation retranslation. But I win.
Yeah, you absolutely do. I was going to say, what the hell does she know? But actually, she's the translator of the blooming book. But okay, score one for Jo. And I will be back.
And actually, no, maybe this puts us back to nil, because I also very briefly spoke with Patricia Lockwood to let her know that I was in her corner. This is from episode 1. In which I said that I thought she'd been robbed for the prize that year. And she wrote in to say, no. Debut books that win are cursed. And I had to write back to her and say that, no, I think Douglas Stewart broke that curse, because he's doing all right, isn't he?
He is doing all right.
Young Mungo's selling well. He's still at Hay Festival. He's still having a good time. So, Patricia, give yourself some credit. You should have won.
Oh, that's good. So some people are actually listening. Blimey. This is great news. The slightly less good news is that we now come to the bit of the show where we have the pleasure stroke hideous ordeal of getting to know each other with the aid of probing questions that we put to each other. Oh, Jo, what have you got for me this week?
So my question to you this week is actually related to the book we're reading. In The Amber Spyglass, and indeed in the Historic Materials universe, characters have an external manifestation of their soul called daemons, and it takes the shape of an animal, and it's usually a sort of dead giveaway as to what sort of person you are. So my question to you, James, is what form would your demon take?
In other words, your question to me is, what is the essence of me?
Yes. What's the essence of your soul, James?
I told you it was an ordeal. Well, actually, just to deflect for a second.
No deflecting.
No, into literary criticism. The idea of a demon that represents your entire essence works really well in the book. But thinking about it now makes me wonder, actually, do we have an essence? Because I struggle to find out the one thing that sums up the rich complexity of all that I am. Mm-hmm. So I wondered if I could palm you off with a chameleon. But a chameleon, can change and then slightly gets around the idea that there is one single essence of exactly who you are. But anyway, if I suppose I do quite like people to like me, is a characteristic of mine. So maybe a sort of slightly needy, tail-wagging dog.
Oh, do you know what kind of dog?
No, one of those sort of mongrel-y, but but it goes up to people, doesn't completely bound up, doesn't grab their legs and go onto their shoulders, but just sort of hangs around. I don't know. Well, in fact, not only that, I'm coming straight back at you, because my question to you is, what would your demon be then, Jo?
See, I prepared, James, and I thought about this for about half an hour, and I did like 3 internet quizzes and disagreed with all of them.
I thought about it for about 5 days and I still couldn't get anywhere.
But I think mine would be an otter. And
okay.
No, it would be an otter, because otters are amazing. They are playful and they learn really fast. They're intelligent and they can survive alone, but they're also really fond of contact. They like hugging. And I feel like I'm an otter.
That's very good.
I would be an otter.
Okay, you win that one. Much better answer than my flanneling about.
Yeah, because you apparently don't have an essence.
One single essence. I mean, we can maybe return to this when we talk about the demons in the book.
Philip Pullman, if you're listening, please write in and explain to us whether we have an essence or not.
Single essence, Philip Pullman. But actually, so let's move on to this. Obviously, the Amber Spyglass is the third book in the series, His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. Or as he would say it, the last third of a single book. So I think we do need a bit of background, Joe. Can you fill us in on the His Dark Materials universe?
The His Dark Materials books are a trilogy comprised of Northern Lights, or as it was published in the States, The Golden Compass, The Subtle Knife, and The Amber Spyglass, which is the book we're discussing today. Pullman's universe contains a multiverse, but it's less Marvel and more astrophysics. And our protagonist is a girl called Lyra Blackware, or as she's renamed, Lyra Silvertongue. In Lyra's specific world, people have externalized manifestations of their soul called demons, and these take the shape of animals. Lyra's world is also governed by a version of the, I would say Catholic, but potentially just Christian church called the Magisterium. And in this biblical retelling, God is named the authority and his bidding is carried out by a regent called the Metatron. Lyra's world also contains a visible version of what we might call dark matter. And in the book, it's called dust with a capital D. What exactly dust is the main point of contention for these three books. For the Magisterium, dust is the root of all sin, but more scientifically minded people, such as Lyra's father, Lord Asriel, believe that dust may in fact be the center to all being or human consciousness, that it may be something completely apart from what the church believes it to be. So Lord Asriel is hell-bent on finding out exactly what dust is as a way to diminishing the power of the Magisterium. And in the first book, on this mission, he kills Lyra's best and only friend, Roger, in this pursuit, which sets Lyra on her own path to finding out the meaning of dust. In the second book, she picks up an ally from our world. His name is Will Parry, and he becomes the bearer of an item called the Subtle Knife, which can cut portals through to other worlds, and it becomes an immensely useful tool for them. Lyra's parents are Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter. They give her up when she's a baby to the care of Oxford College in this parallel world that's called Jordan. Lord Asriel is an aristocrat with highly scientific pursuits. By book 3, he's a rebel leader determined to take on the kingdom of heaven, whereas Miss Coulter is kind of his polar opposite. She is a servant of the Magisterium, quite high-ranking, as well as an academic. And she, in book 1, runs something called the General Oblation Board, which separates children from their demons as a way to prevent them from acquiring sin, which is really a way to say to stop them from ever reaching sexual maturity or
growing up,
free will, or
moving from innocence to
up.
experience. Yeah.
But as she moves through the novel, her re-evolving love for her daughter leads her to stray from the church. And I think the only other thing that's really necessary to us is that there's a prophecy with Lyra at the heart of it, given in book 1, naming her the second Eve, as in Adam and Eve, as in Eve who succumbs to temptation from a serpent, eats an apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and brings about the fall of mankind. The church believes that she'll bring about the fall of mankind, but in this telling, it's worded more as she is destined to bring an end to destiny, and you can interpret that freely.
Yeah, and in a way, consciousness and what the church calls original sin are sort of the same thing, aren't they? So,
well, knowledge, basically, free will. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. That was most pithily expressed. Thanks very much, Joe.
So we haven't even actually gotten to a summary of the Amber Spyglass yet. But actually, James, I'd be really keen to hear your summary of the Amber Spyglass, because this is a novel that I read as a child, it's probably going to be the only time in my life on this podcast that I can say, well, back in my day.
No, back in your day, I'll be very interested. We'll get onto that, what you made of it as a child, because coming to at my great age, it's not obvious why it's a children's book, really. I mean, it's got children in it, and children are the heroes, but it's quite a complicated and. I mean, there aren't many children's books that make you want to reread John Milton's Paradise Lost, but this really does, because it's quite heavily based on it.
Give it a bash. Go on, tell us what it's about.
Okay, well, I'll try. It's a bit like that Monty Python thing of summarise Proust in 30 seconds, but I'll give it a go. This book starts with Lyra, a prisoner of the woman who's turned out to be a mother, who at this stage is one of the book's big baddies, Mrs. Coulter, beautiful but deadly. Her demon being a golden monkey of a slightly vicious kind.
I always wanted that monkey.
No, it's a pretty cool gold monkey. And she's got Lyra drugged in a cave, really. And at this stage, because she's a baddie, we're not quite sure whether she's up to no good or whether, as she claims, she's trying to protect Lyra from the fact that basically, at this point, Lyra's the sort of MacGuffin of the book. Everyone's heading towards this cave in the Himalayas where Lyra is holed up, including the magisterium, which is Boo the church, the goodies trying to fix her. Trying to rescue her, and various types of goodies, and also Will, the boy with the subtle knife, and they do rescue her. And she has had, in the meantime, a vision of Roger, the guy you mentioned who got killed, and she decides that what they need to do is visit the House of the Dead, the home of the dead, the world of the dead. Thank you, and rescue everybody. Which, with the aid of the subtle knife, they do. They're unbelievably sort of powerful and tense and thought-provoking passages in which they do visit the world of the dead and manage to free the people there. And because this is essentially an atheist book, I think, really, so they are liberated from the sort of boredom and hideousness of a magisterium-based afterlife, which is not heavenly in the slightest. It just means you hang around, and they rescue people, and they disappear into their atoms dissolve, and they disappear back into the universe with great pleasure. There's then the biggest showdown, which is between the forces of good and evil, really. I'd be interested to know how much you think Pullman's heart is in the big showdown, because in most books like this, and particularly most children's books like this, you might imagine that the big clash between the forces of good and evil.
It's like a whole movie sequence. You'd think it would take a long
also
time.
The big finish. It's done in a few pages with 100 pages still to go.
Yeah.
Before he sort of gets back to his main concerns, which is the attempt, I think, of the goodies, which Lord Asriel has now become. Mrs. Coulter seems to have been...
I would flip that. See, I think Asriel is still a terrible person, and Coulter's the one who actually redeems herself.
I mean, she does redeem herself by, much to her surprise, loving her daughter, doesn't she? And so those two, I think it's hard to do this without spoiler alerts, but those two eventually destroy a god, essentially. Well, God himself, the authority, is by this time so tired and old and everything that as soon as he sort of meets the air, he dissolves.
Yeah.
It's which made me think, funny enough, of sort of the disappearance of Catholic Ireland in recent years. This thing that seemed absolutely rock solid just suddenly goes. Anyway, those two sacrifice themselves, getting rid of the Megatron figure, the Jesus...
Metatron.
The Metatron, thanks.
Megatron is Transformers,
thanks.
I think.
No, thanks very much. No, you are definitely my Philip Pullman vocabulary consultant. So anyway, they destroy him, the Jesus one.
No, he's not Jesus. That's actually really important.
Is he the Archangel Michael?
He's like a regent, because at this point, the authority or God himself is kind of trapped in a crystal box. You can tell I read this as a child and took it really seriously, but he's trapped in a crystal box and he's too ancient to do anything. So the Metatron is sort of like an authoritarian-like figure who intends to start intervening in human life on behalf of God.
So he's more the church than Jesus, you think? More the sort of.
I think in Pullman's mind, he kind of represents the authoritarianism of the Catholic Church, and God himself is this kind of non-entity who is used as a kind of stand-in to justify heinous acts.
Because Pullman wrote the book for adults, which I must say I haven't read, called The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ.
I haven't read that either.
Which I believe is based on the fact that Jesus himself, good bloke.
Famously.
I possibly, yes, that's right. So we're like, good bloke. But Christ, his sort of shadowy alter ego, is the churchy bit. So a line by Tom Waits, you can say this as gospel, but I say that it's only church. So anyways, the Metatron's that. They get rid of him, as I say, in this slightly anticlimactic big climax, and then it settles down back to Lyra and Will essentially falling in love, and we begin to realise what the real sort of climax of the book, which is the transition from innocence to experience.
Yes.
We mentioned the difference between children and adult sin, where their demons work, and in various other ways throughout the book. And the big change comes when Lyra basically has a sexual awakening.
Yeah.
And a sexual awakening, oddly enough, cut in America. I might just read this. So
James always manages to make this sound dirty.
No, there's
I was
really-
saying
I've
to
got
him
a really-
last
I've got-
night
I've got a-
that it was so wholesome in my mind before he read it to me.
No, I've got a proper dirty bit coming up later. But the other one character we haven't mentioned is someone called Mary Malone, who's
Yes.
a doctor in our version of Oxford, so Will's version of Oxford, who Lyra contacts, and she's been studying the dust as sort of dark matter in
Yes.
our modern scientific understanding. But she makes contact with it and then joins the universe in which they all there. And she talks about how she used to be a nun, and then she discovered human love, really.
Yeah.
And that made her think. I mean, it's slightly, there's a possible author's message here. She says, I used to be a nun, you see. I thought physics could be done to the glory of God till I saw there wasn't any God at all, and that the physics was more interesting anyway. But anyway, after that author's message, she talks about love, and then it says, as Mary said that, Lyra felt something strange happen to her body. She felt a stirring at the roots of her hair. She found herself breathing faster. She had never been on a roller coaster or anything like one, but if she had, she would have recognized the sensations in her breast. They were exciting and frightening at the same time, and she had not the slightest idea why. The sensation continued and deepened and changed as more parts of her body found themselves affected too. A passage is entirely cut from the American edition.
Yeah.
Interestingly, but she's 13, isn't she, at this stage? It's the transition from innocence to experience in a way of which Pullman clearly approves, that the fall of man is a good thing.
Yeah.
And I think I'll end the summary there. There is a sort of heartbreaking climax, but maybe we should spare the spoil.
Yeah.
Maybe we should not spoil that. But essentially,
Well, you just spoiled it, James.
oh, sorry. Okay, maybe we'll cut that. So the question, as I say, first question that sprung to mind for me, and I'd be very interested seeing as you read it as a kid.
Mhm.
I mean, is this a children's book?
I'm going to give a cop-out of an answer and say yes and no. My argument for no is that it's maybe sort of arbitrarily cast as a children's book purely for marketing purposes.
That's sort of Pullman's
Really?
line. He's two things he seems to still be slightly annoyed about, even after sort of 20 odd years, is the idea that it's definitely a children's book. He argues that it was just published by children's publishers, and so that's, for example, why the American edition had to get rid of that the roller coaster of her body.
Yeah.
And also he resists the idea of fantasy because he thinks in a way it's just quite realistic, but just in different world.
Well, I mean, so I used to work as a bookseller for about 3 years, and the thing that I always found really interesting is that shelving books in particular sections or under various kind of genres or categories was mainly just a classification system to benefit the people selling the novel rather than the people buying it. So often I would have customers come up to me righteously outraged that a book they felt should be in social history or political science was in self-help, you know?
Yeah.
And in a way, I feel that way about Pullman in the sense that this deeply, deeply philosophical book that, as you say, does make you want to reread Milton. In my case, it really made me want to reread William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. That's a lot of where Pullman drew his source material from as well.
If I just interjected there, I think almost the key to it, certainly as Pullman sees that the key to the book is Blake's famous comment on Milton, that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. that essentially that Paradise Lost is on the side of Satan for taking on the well, I mean, partly because Milton himself was a regicide, wasn't he? He helped to overthrow Charles I. So the idea that you overthrow this great sort of authority figure.
Yeah.
But
then I wonder about
Milton can't
that.
shake off the fact that that was quite a noble thing to try and do. I suppose I'd like to answer directly my question.
Yeah.
What on earth did you make of it when you read it as a kid?
Yeah. So I was coming to this because actually what I made of it as a kid, I felt, again, quite powerfully while I was reading it this time around. I cocooned myself for like one single day to reread this book in one massive chunk. And I felt much as I did as a child, that I was just being taken on the most amazing adventure. And it's not even nostalgia that I felt, because the point at which I read it, I hated being a child. So I can't even say that it made me long for childhood. I think it's been so long since I read a novel that in some ways was quite straightforwardly a story that had this protagonist who is on a great quest, and she has friends who help her on this quest, and this really concrete world that has very specific laws and logic that you kind of learn by heart and learn to follow. And I got just as absorbed in it as I was when I think I read this around 11 or 12. Around 11 or 12, none of the allegorical aspects of the book really registered on a rational surface level. So I was raised Catholic, but I didn't really care too much about
So was the church, you just saw that as baddies rather than some sort of theological...
You see, I think sort of, but I wasn't so concerned with picking apart the text to figure out. I was just happy to let Pullman carry me. And I think that's one of the things that in my eyes is what throws the idea of this being a children's book in doubt, but equally makes me feel like it really should be called a children's book, because it's so open-ended and nuanced and subtle in a way that most of kids' literature really, really isn't. It's a book that asks children, if they're reading it, to make their own mind up over whether they're on the side of, quote unquote, good or evil, what they make of various characters' actions, where their sympathies lie, but without moralizing, without really telling them how to feel or what to think. He kind of offers you this world, this biblical retelling sheathed in fantasy and allegory and make-believe. And he just lets you go through it lightly. And I wish more children's literature was like that. So I do want it to be.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So if we say it's not a children's book, then we're underestimating children, is essentially what you're
he
suggesting.
Treats children like they have a brain, essentially, and are capable of kind of thinking through, maybe not as in clear-cut fashion as adults do, but subconsciously thinking through how they see the world, what their morality is, where they align, in a way that a lot of other kids' books really, really don't.
Get the impression even Philip Pullman hasn't got it all kind of nailed. I mean, he talked afterwards about he wasn't sure he quite explained or he quite knew what dust was, even after he'd finished the whole book. And there's sort of bits of stories that come along and disappear. There's a bit where when they're going to the, the world of the dead, someone explains to Lyra that we have our death with us at all times, and that when the moment comes, we're quietly sort of tapped on the shoulder and said, okay, mate.
Now you go.
It's now. It's a lovely, lovely, but powerful idea. That sort of goes away as well. So there are things that just sort of come and slightly go, aren't there?
Yeah.
And all sorts of storytelling. We maybe should talk about that.
Well, I would say that someone who's a really instructive figure is Mary Malone, the woman who's supposed to play the serpent and tempt Lyra, or basically just lead Lyra to adult knowledge or a sexual awakening. She's a really great example of how Pullman doesn't instruct, rather he just sort of guides here and there. There's a point where...
up to a point, I think. I think she's the nearest we get to an author's message. When she basically says that, there is no God and physics is all.
Well, see, I don't think she even really does, because there's a point here when she's talking about... She's telling Lyra and Will what it was like to leave the convent and stop being a nun and go in pursuit of science. And she's not very clear-cut on how they should think about that either. She says, while she was at the church, I knew what I should think. It was whatever the church taught me to think. And when I did science, I had to think about other things altogether. So I never had to think about them for myself at all. But do you now? Said Will. I think I have to, Mary said, trying to be accurate. When you stopped believing in God, he went on, did you stop believing in good and evil? No, but I stopped believing that there was a power of good and a power of evil that were outside us. And I came to believe that good and evil are names for what people do, not for what they are. All we can say that is good is a good deed because it helps someone, or that it's an evil one because it hurts them. People are too complicated to have simple labels. Yes, said Lyra firmly. Did you miss God? Asked Will. Yes, Mary said. Terribly. And I still do. And what I miss most is the sense of being connected to the whole of the universe. I used to feel I was connected to God like that, and because he was there, I was connected to the whole of his creation. But if he's not there, then... And she kind of trails off, and that trailing off is a really great sort of like, but what then? What if?
No, I think Pullman himself, there's a great interview which I commend to our listeners of him and Mary Beard on BBC iPlayer. Two basically old intellectual E-types just sort of talking about anything. But both of them sort of end up saying that they rather miss God, including Pullman. But actually, can I just score one for me? That bit where it says people are too complicated to have simple labels. That's what I think is my...
can't have a demon.
You can't have a single demon. Yeah, thank you very much. A single essence of yourself. Anyway, and then so Milton, he's got in his sights where the rebel angels take on God and lose, but in this one it's a replay. The rebel angels take on God and win in this book, which is an astonishingly ambitious thing to do in any book, let alone a children's book. Even in Milton, I just point out that when the fall happens, the archangel Michael explains to Adam what's going to happen from here on in, and he says, obviously the world's going to be much worse now that you've fallen, but then Jesus will come along and redeem us, redeem you all. And there's the famous phrase where Adam says, "Oh, happy fall." So in fact, it was better to have fallen. So even Milton seems to be slightly on the side of original sin as well as Pullman certainly is. That original sin is good because that's what makes us human.
Well, it's not even sin, really. I felt like that was the whole contention of
yes, you're right.
Dust of you think of it at first as sin, but really it's just human consciousness.
Yes, that's
and
right.
Sorry,
yes, original sin.
What makes up all the universes in this world, what makes them function.
Another writer that he's certainly got in his sights and has made no bones about it is C.S. Lewis, isn't it? In a way, this is a sort of answer to Narnia. He's slightly backtrack on that over the years, but I think it sort of clearly is. And the thing he seems to hate about C.S. Lewis, and in fact all classic children's literature, I think is an interesting idea, that all the sort of golden age of children's literature is based on the idea that it's a bad thing to grow up. That it would be great if we could just be children forever.
Yeah, that's true. That makes me think of Roald Dahl.
Yeah, and I think Susan at the end of Narnia isn't allowed into the equivalent of heaven because she's got sort of lipstick and started taking an interest in boys and so on.
Oh, yeah.
And his point is that actually it's an extremely good thing to grow up.
Yeah.
That's what the dust is. Innocence becoming experience. Moving from innocence to experience is not a tragic falling off or not. No, it's not a tragic falling off, actually. It's rather a triumphant thing to happen.
No, it's great. There's at the end of the book, so Lyra has this device called an alethiometer, and she can read it and basically discover the truth about anything. And by the end of the book, she loses her ability to read it around the same time that she sort of hits puberty and comes into her version of knowledge and sexual awakening. And she really despairs over this because she feels like it's the only talent she had was to be able to intuit all of the knowledge in the world. And there's this really beautiful passage where I think a witch says to her, you used to be able to read it by grace, but now you're going to have to read it through knowledge. You're going to have to work and learn how to do it properly. And that's such a beautiful analogy of moving from being a child to an adult in a, without the scariness of it, or maybe actually with the scariness, but it makes it seem a lot more positive that before you were sort of floundering around and doing things however you could. But at a certain point, you just build your life and you learn how to do these things that you were kind of stumbling around with properly and in a way that has purpose and is sort of more beneficial to you as opposed to other people, which is how the alethiometer was being used previously.
Yes, no, I think that's true. I would slightly backtrack on my idea that innocence to experience is just a great triumph because it does involve loss, doesn't it, as well?
Yeah.
Is that true? I think you know the Blake Songs of Innocence and Experience better than I do. Is that got the same thing that it's better? to summarise the entire William Blake thing, it's better and worse.
No, but it's really, really true. So for those who haven't read Songs of Innocence and Experience, they're kind of two pamphlets made into one book, and the poems are parallels of each other. So you have the first bit, Songs of Innocence, which are these really beautiful, straightforward sometimes couplets, but basically with a very regular rhyming scheme about light and the creation of life and how happy and joyful it is to be a child or a person. And then these are kind of replayed in the second bit of the book as songs of experience, which are a lot more insidious and complex, and, you know, things like sex or wrath or revenge start to creep in.
The poem that people will know, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright.
Yes, which is a counterpart to the Little Lamb.
So it's Little Lamb in Innocence, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright in the forests of the night.
I love that poem because it contains those beautiful sets of lines when the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears. It's just amazing poetry. Go read them if you haven't. I think even Songs of Experience counters the idea of simplicity in those first books, but in a way, it's so much better. Like they're much more, even if you think about them on a kind of line by line sense, the poems are a greater achievement in a way. They're more pleasurable to read. They're a lot more complex. The first ones you kind of bounce through without really thinking much about them. And then the second set, you feel a lot more kind of enriched, presumably for, you know, the experience of innocence. I think it's a lot like Pullman in the sense that, like Mary Malone says, there is no inherent good or evil. There's just the experience of what your actions mean.
Yeah. No, and he does say, I think at the end of the Amber Spyglass has certainly said in interviews that basically everything he's ever read is in these books. So we've done Milton, we've done C.S. Lewis, which he's read and hated, Milton, which he's read and loved, Blake. But there's also there's epic stuff. He used to be a teacher and he said in that interview with Mary Beard that I mentioned, he laments the fact that teachers have to stick to a curriculum, because he basically used to tell his pupils stories from the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he's according to Pullman, he had them in the absolute palm of his hand, and he'd time a cliffhanger for the bell. He prided himself on that, and he wouldn't be allowed to do that as a teacher anymore. I do slightly wonder if the pupils did think that, or whether they thought, bloody hell, Mr. Pullman's off on one again. But anyway, there's certainly epic stuff. There's even bits of the Western. There's an armoured bear that we haven't mentioned.
Yorick Burnison.
The very
I love the names in this book.
Yeah, Yorick Burnison.
And Lee Scoresby, an aeronaut, is a very Western figure.
Yes, he is. And when we first meet, Yorick.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're definitely better on your Pullman vocab than me. He's basically a washed-up old gunslinger, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's like he's boozing. He's
a drunk.
Yeah, and he's boozing, and he's just in this barding.
We should clarify, this is in the first book rather than this third one.
Yes, it is. And Lyra basically gets him to saddle up and fight, you know, to come out one more time. I think that's good. See, there's a bit of Proust in there as well, because Mary Malone's remembrance of how much when she's a nun is that when she was a girl, she had some marzipan at a party at the same time as she rather fancied a boy.
Yeah.
And then when she's being at a conference front, when she isn't nun, this rather handsome man feeds her some marzipan.
Oh my God.
and she remembers that thing, and that's the end of...
I hadn't made that connection.
That's the end of God, really. once that marzipan goes in.
What is it in the Proust?
It's Madeleine cake.
It's the Madeleine, yeah.
Yeah, so you take the Madeleine cake dipped in tea, and suddenly the whole memory comes back. And also, as you say, an adventure yarn with lots of fighting.
Yeah.
And all pretty much seamlessly mixed.
You kind of forget as you're going along, because there's this like huge sense of adventure that they're kids, and what is happening to them, fighting rebel angels, being exploited by adults, is really like prolifically heavy stuff.
One little trope I noticed, that there's no matter what happens, no matter how many, after the most ferocious battle with armoured bears and witches and spirits and they always get a good kip, don't they? Lyra just goes to sleep.
They need it. I found that
she's always just going to sleep. I think I'd be slightly restless after that day, but she's just like, okay.
No, but you know what I really love is that, like, they do all of this, and then he's very careful to be like, and their bodies really hurt. They were sore. They were dirty. It's not like a lot of fantasy novels. Sorry to Philip Pullman, but I think this does come under the category of fantasy. That doesn't limit it to anything else, but it is partially a fantasy novel. People will just like magically be okay after a whole day of like trekking over mountains, or they'll just bounce along to the next chapter. Whereas Pullman is like, no, these people are knackered. They're at the edge of their...
No, that's true. And the price of getting the subtle knife is Will has to lose 2 of his fingers.
Yeah.
And I kept expecting those to grow back in some magical way. They don't, do they?
No, they really don't. And they hurt for like 2 books.
Yeah, they do.
It's great. And the only thing that I think strays away from that logic, but which I don't mind because I have a massive crush on her, is Miss Coulter, who is sort of eternally poised and beautiful no matter what happens to her. If she's disheveled within like 5 minutes, she's back to looking great. And I would argue that's a slightly unrealistic female standard. But then again, I love Miss Coulter. And I had a crush on her when I was little, and I still have a crush on her now. So I'm fine with it.
I think Philip Pullman might join you in that crush, actually. I get the impression. But on the non-fantasy side as well, there's also a bit at the beginning of the Amber Spyglass where he finds a rucksack that belongs to someone who's recently died. And one of the things he takes out of it is Kendall mint cake. So for the first few chapters, he's chewing Kendall mint cake, which again you
is that a real thing?
Yeah. Oh, go. Yes, it is. It's and it's particularly sort of because Kendall is in the Lake District.
When did that go out of fashion?
I don't think it ever did it, Joe? It's certainly big with hikers in the Lake District. Hence the name
cool.
Kendall. It's very it gives you loads of energy because basically sugar, very minty.
Nice.
And then did you see the film in which Nicole Kidman, I believe, stars as Mrs. Coulter?
Yeah, I'm team Ruth Wilson.
Okay.
Loved Ruth Wilson since Luther. We're just airing out all my crushes since childhood.
But clearly that was meant to be the first of a trilogy, and my understanding of why it wasn't, it did pretty well all over the world, but didn't do very well in America because of it being anti-religious. But he's quoted in quite a lot of American sources as saying, "I want to undermine the Christian faith." In fact, not only that, he told the Washington Post in 2001. Now, I don't know if, first of all, fine if that seems okay to me, but if he did actually say that, or whether that just sort of passed around. But anyway, it didn't do very well in America.
I feel like that opens up 2 interesting conversations. The first is Pullman saying that he wants to undermine Christian faith.
If he did say that in those stock terms, that's what I'm slightly
contentious. But I think, I view this book more as an anti-establishment, ergo anti-church book, more than one that's anti-spirituality. And there are several points in the book where this idea of spirituality, because what is the concept of a soul if not spiritual, is given a lot of credence alongside essentially the work that Pullman carries out as an author. And I'm not dissing it because, I just rewrote my second book, and I frequently found myself telling people that I was swinging between crippling depression and a God complex. And it's very similar in this set of novels where, perhaps church is bad, but the idea of a spiritual imagination or spiritual living isn't so bad because it enables narrative, imagination, it enables all the things that basically lead one to write a novel.
No, I was working on theory which I haven't fully worked out, that idea of Blake's that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, whether Pullman's of God's party without knowing it. Okay, Joe, well, I did promise you that I had worse filth than the bit before, so I'm afraid prepare to have your childhood dreams slightly shattered.
It's not dreams, James, it's memories. It's heartfelt memories that you're ruining right now.
And here we go, with those memory-ruining lines. So this is Will and Lyra. Will put his hand on hers. A new mood had taken hold of him, and he felt resolute and peaceful. Knowing exactly what he was doing and exactly what it would mean, he moved his hand from Lyra's wrist and stroked the red gold fur of her demon. Lyra gasped. Well, you would. But her surprise was mixed with a pleasure so like the joy that flooded through her when she had put the fruit to his lips that she couldn't protest because she was breathless. With a racing heart, she responded in the same way. She put her hand on the silky warmth of Will's demon, and as her fingers tightened in the fur, she knew that Will was feeling exactly what she was. Come on, that is filth.
Thanks, James.
I suppose one thing we shouldn't forget is that this is a Booker Prize podcast, and we haven't mentioned the Booker Prize yet, apart from the fact that this was, well, I introduced it as the only children's book ever longlisted for the Booker Prize, where do we stand on the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime? This is where it all gets a little, because that was
That's very
longlisted as well.
woolly. I haven't
Yeah.
read it. So.
I've read it. I think it's really good, and I have no idea if it's a children's book or not. But then I felt the same about his Dark Materials.
Yeah.
I think
it's very
maybe
interesting.
it isn't. I don't think it is necessarily. So I don't want to invalidate my own introduction. Maybe
No.
So this is the only one, and it was a good year, 2001. It was won by True History of the Kelly Gang, although the hot favourite was Atonement by Ian McEwan, which I think is pretty good.
Oh, it's amazing. Another child at the centre of the narrative in that one.
Indeed. I mean, you might be more in touch again, if such a thing can be imagined, with with recent children's literature. But is there lots of great stuff going on in children's books? Should more children's books have been shortlisted or longlisted for the Booker, do you think?
I can't quite think of any children's books that match what Pullman does in the His Dark Materials trilogy. And I was also a huge fan of the Sally Lockhart series, which he also wrote, and those don't hold a candle to these either. I feel like he's created an incredibly singular achievement. It's interesting because there's nothing in Booker submissions guidelines that stops people from submitting children's fiction or any kind of genre fiction. The remit is just that you need to believe that it's good quality literature, that the author is alive at the time of submission, I think, that the work is published in English, and that the press that publishes it releases 2 books or 2 novels a year. That's the only thing you really need to submit for the Booker Prize. I was running through what I read as a child last night to see if there was anything I wished had made it on a Booker long list or short list. I really couldn't think of anything. That's not to say that I didn't have some great reading through childhood. Enid Blyton, Roald Dahl, Lemony Snicket, although he wouldn't have qualified at that point because Americans hadn't been let in yet. And I do wonder, if a series of unfortunate events were to be published as one massive book, would that stand a chance? Because that's similarly kind of morally murky and strange. But maybe I don't know. That these books are really incomparable to anything.
I must say, I nothing I read as a child I would think would be in Booker's shortlist. My memory, which is now getting a bit is cutting from sort of William and Billy Bunter and straight to Agatha Christie at about the age of 10 or 11.
Yeah, no, I did something similar.
Or 12 even. And then I read things like The Silver Sword is a really good book, but I think that was the 50s. There was ones you read that you thought, yeah, that's a bit of cut above my usual fare.
To our faithful listeners, if there is a children's book that you can think of that, could potentially have been longlisted, shortlisted, or even won, please tell us. The only thing that's really creeping to my mind, and I'm not sure because I read it so long ago, but it's something like Neil Gaiman's Stardust. But again, can you really call that a children's book? I'd love to hear about a clear-cut children's book that could have potentially made it onto a Booker long list at least. Okay, so
I suppose, again, what seems to be becoming a traditional question is, who would you recommend this to? Children, adults?
Everyone.
I'm with you. I think everyone.
Everyone.
And this was just not. I think the reason I'd never read it before is it doesn't seem a direct mail shot.
Yeah.
Partly marketed as a children's book, partly it is quite fantasy, which is not one of my big favourite things.
No, but it's so sprawling.
It's so much else, and so much of everything else. And I think it's fantastic. I would warmly recommend it to anybody, actually. Okay, Joe, time for our Booker Clinic, where we answer questions from listeners about recommending books to help them solve their problems. What's our problem today that we're solving instantly?
Our problem today, having survived the trials of early parenthood, my children are now sleeping through, and I have sufficient time and mental concentration to start reading again. What book should I choose to reintroduce me to the joys of reading?
Okay, let me take a couple of shots at this. As ever, slightly off the top of the head. I always think for the joys of reading, for sheer pleasure, I would always recommend Raymond Chandler. I think they're brilliant. And I've read them, when sick, or my mum read them when having children. Maybe it's just a family thing, but when you just, they're wonderful to read, and they're not hard, but they are brilliant. They are, it's the classic hard-boiled, sort of invented LA hard-boiled detective fiction. Things like it was a blonde to make a bishop kick a hole in a stained glass window, all that kind of stuff. But interestingly enough, Chandler himself was an English public schoolboy, went to Dulwich. I don't know if we've had this before, but Chandler and P.G. Woodhouse both had the same English teacher at Dulwich College. I mean, imagine looking back on your teaching career and thinking, well, I taught two of the greatest stylists of the 20th century. So Chandler, and then if you want to sort of flashback or to celebrate the fact that you're free of this, I think one of the best writers about having small children is Helen Simpson, who perhaps significantly wrote short stories rather than epic novels because she had small children. And there's one scene I remember in particular where the couple are on holiday with their small kids and the husband sort of goes off rather suspiciously for an hour and a half. And when he comes back, it's not that he's drunk or that he's been, on the beach, or anything. And she realizes what's up and she says to him, "You've been reading." And the poor bloke has just snuck off for an hour with his book and obviously not allowed. And I think the collection that I'm pretty sure I'm thinking of is her first one, Four Bare Legs in a Bed. She then goes on to write about having older children than that. But if you want to remember those sleepless, hideous nights, then I think it's Four Bare Legs in a Bed by Helen Simpson. I recommend all their works. It's fantastic.
I did have a rough patch in reading around the end of my undergraduate degree because I'd done so much of it and I really just didn't want to do any more. And the thing that got me back into it were the Patrick Melrose novels by Edward St. Aubyn. And I think Mother's Milk at some point was either longlisted or shortlisted.
Shortlisted, was, yeah. Because I had a friend on the judging panel who was absolutely heartbroken that Mother's Milk didn't win.
Well, Mother's Milk, I don't know if for your purposes, dear listener, this really works because it is a book about family upheaval generally. And the main character, Patrick Melrose, is kind of suffering both the breakdown of his marriage and also his mother has requested that he aid her in committing suicide. But that makes it sound really, really heavy, but it's so pithily done.
I mean, funny. It's really funny.
It's so
line
funny.
by line, it's really, really funny.
And they are fairly slender books, the whole of them, or four of them, I think it is.
I think five by the end.
It's a lot, but like each one is actually quite slim.
Yeah,
and you'd think they'd be tragic because they do concern fairly tragic family subject matter. But the thing is, Edward St. Aubyn is so scathing. And I think the thing that really brought me back to reading because of those books was just remembering that I could laugh at a novel, even if it did contain serious subject matter. I could cackle.
It's extremely funny. I don't know the second that you've reminded me that if you want to read a Raymond Chandler that's got a slightly smug title in the circumstances, The Big Sleep.
Yeah.
You can finally have a big sleep. But if you have a dilemma you think the books might remedy, be honest with you, obviously before we actually went on air, the problems were coming from the four corners of the producer's laptop. Now, we want to throw it open to everybody. So please do send any queries you might have to the Booker Clinic.
Which you can do by sending an email to contactus@bookerprizefoundation.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a rating and a review. You can also sign up to our Substack at the Booker Prizes, where you'll get long reads, exclusive content and prize updates. And finally, please do follow us on all our socials at the Booker Prizes.
Thanks so much. And of course, we don't say that in a needy way. It's been great to be with you today, talking about Philip Pullman, and it's goodbye from me.
And me. See you next time.
Bye. The Booker Prize podcast is hosted by Joe Hamya and me, James Walton. It's produced and edited by Benjamin Sutton, and the executive producer is John Davenport. It's a Daddy Super Yacht production for the Booker Prizes.